Our story begins today in 1760 with the succession of George III to the throne of England. George was the third of a line of German kings called the Hanovers, who had been brought over to England by Parliament in 1714 to rule the United Kingdom. Americans were very fond of the Hanover kings. They viewed them as just and caring and religious. Hanover rulers were seen as protectors of the Protestant religion and of the lives, liberty, and property of Englishmen everywhere. In November of 1760, George II died and his grandson George III succeeded to the throne. He inherited not only the crown, but also a war, the French and Indian War that we talked about, I believe, last time, an enormous debt, and a family history of insanity. When the war ended in 1763, some leaders in Parliament believed that it should have gone on, that had it gone on, England would have acquired even more territory from France and Spain than it actually did. It acquired the largest empire in the world at the time, but there were some who wanted more. George, on the other hand, began to realize that while England may be winning the war, the cost of the war was phenomenal, and England was practically bankrupt. In 1763, George's chief minister was George Grenville, our second George in the story. Grenville was left with the unenviable task of raising enough money to pull Britain out of debt. At the same time, he had to keep the British from paying any more taxes than they already did. A series of wars and the need to pay for them had created a crushing tax burden in England. People paid more taxes than ever before, and the government feared that if the burden were increased further, Britain would face a rebellion. So Grenville proposed that the American colonies shoulder their fair share of the taxes. After all, he argued, with some justice, most of the expense of Britain's last two wars had gone to defend the colonists. Britain hastily agreed with Grenville. He decided that the government should put America on a pay-as-you-go basis. They should pay the price of royal government and the defense of their colonies. It was not crushing over-taxation, as the colonists would complain. The highest tax in America would still be about a fourth of what the ordinary Englishman paid. But taxes were something that colonists didn't like very much. In fact, taxes, as far as the colonists were concerned, were things that should only happen to other people. Their taxes were already very low, and in fact, some colonies paid no taxes at all. Grenville began with a tax plan that was designed to raise customs revenues on sugar and molasses. There was already a sugar tax of 6 pence per gallon on non-European sugar, but the Americans rarely paid it. The northern colonies had a thriving rum industry, especially in New England. They used all of the molasses that they could get from the English colonies in the West Indies, which were not taxed at all, but they used every single drop and still needed more. So they bought molasses from the French, the Spanish, and Dutch colonies as well. Rather than pay the sugar tax, they smuggled the molasses into their colonies. Smuggling, in fact, was a respected profession in New England. And the smuggling had even continued during the French and Indian War. English officials were horrified that the molasses trade with French colonies continued even though Great Britain was at war with France. As food prices rose in the French Indies, New England smugglers traded wheat and corn for molasses and made a killing. The British government was not amused. So Grenville's first program for America was a new Sugar Act. In 1763, he cut the tax from sixpence a pound to threepence a pound, 3 pennies per pound, but he vowed to enforce it. New rules and regulations were created to get the tax collected. More red tape, more paperwork, lots of new fees, new courts that were meant to try the smugglers if they were caught, more soldiers and more bigger naval presence in New England was also brought in under the tax, which would make it much harder for the smugglers to achieve their goals. Now, at first, this tax was really only despised by the folks who made rum, by the New Englanders who profited from the smuggling. But many shippers and merchants who were involved in the rum trade had a wide network of communication throughout the colonies and could thus put together a protest that was nearly colony-wide. The next year, 1764, Parliament passed the next plank in Grenville's program. It was called the Currency Act, and it stated that colonial paper currency would no longer be accepted as legal tender for payment of debts. This act was passed because from time to time colonial legislatures created paper money to be used as legal tender for the payment of debts and taxes in the colony. Some colonies inflated their paper money radically, giving it almost no value, which made it great for debtors to pay off their debts. Rhode Island and North Carolina were the worst offenders. New York and Massachusetts were the most careful to maintain good economic sense when it came to paper money. Now, that's very important. There were some colonies that tried to pay their debts to English merchants in worthless paper, and there were other colonies whose paper money almost had the same value as the British pound. But here's the problem. The Currency Act treated all the colonies the same, whether they issued paper money that was worthless or issued paper money that was good, that was valid. Additionally, the Currency Act simply stated American currency. For the first time, Britain used a term that applied to all the colonies at the same time. Now, in the past, I've talked about the fact that the colonies didn't get along, didn't have much to do with each other, didn't even like each other for the most part, and certainly didn't see themselves as part of one big functioning organism called America. But the Currency Act began to change that. American colonists from the various colonies, taking the line from the Currency Act, began to realize that there was some degree of unity among them. Now, this wasn't terribly important in 1764, but as we're going to see, it would become more important over time. In 1763, George III, concerned to promote peace in the American colonies, drew up a proclamation that placed a line down the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. He stated that the west side of the line should belong to the Native American peoples. The white settlement had to stop looking westward at the line. Now, colonists felt that the West was a legitimate reward, the spoils of the French and Indian War. Many colonists became extremely angry with the proclamation of 1763. They felt that the West was a legitimate reward for defeating the French and Indians. They felt that the British government had essentially slammed the door to new opportunity in their faces. It really angered people who had invested a great deal of their time and wealth in land speculation across the Appalachians. And those were, in many cases, very important people in the colonies. Among them, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Robert Morris, and James Madison. Now, we should remember that the Proclamation of 1763 is not a Grenville policy. It was a policy the king made up more or less on his own, but it would appear right at the point in time when the other Grenville Acts were coming out. The most annoying piece of Grenville's legislation was called the Stamp Act. It made practically everybody in the colonies angry. The act was passed because there was a growing suspicion in Britain that the Americans would never voluntarily raise money either to pay for their upkeep and defense or to reduce the British debt. Additionally, a similar stamp tax had been a popular means of raising revenues in Britain. And finally, the tax was expected to raise enough money in the colonies to defray the enormous expense of colonial defense. The stamp tax placed a small tax on all legal processes, legal documents printed on paper that did not have the stamp were not to be recognized in law. It also taxed each page of every colonial newspaper. Now, it was one thing to tax legal documents, but it was quite another to tax newspapers at this rate. There were dozens of newspapers published in the colonies, dailies and weeklies, and newspapers were the mass media of the 1700s and were very cheap. If the printers had to add the cost of the stamped paper to the price of the newspaper, newspapers would suddenly double in price. And so newspaper editors were very angry about this and published their anger in their newspapers all over the colonies. The Stamp Act, this single act, had the effect of uniting all of the colonists against British policy. Now, it's worth noting that Parliament had spent a great deal of time and effort to study the impact of the Stamp Act on the colonies. Parliamentary committees had met and gotten input from colonial agents, that is, agents for the various colonies who lived in London, whose job it was to represent the colony. The most famous of those colonial agents was Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time representing both Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. Franklin said that he saw that there would be no problem. He believed there would be no problem with the Stamp Act, and he said this is probably the best way to raise money from the colonists. Other colonial agents said more or less the same thing. None of them thought it would cause much stir in the colonies. In fact, they even supported the stamp tax. Nobody expected the explosion that would occur as a result of it. So what was the big deal? One problem we've already looked at, but let's talk about it again. It's the way the colonists understood the British Constitution. Englishmen viewed taxes as gifts freely given by the consent of the people through their representative assembly. In the case of the English, that would be Parliament. In the colonies, each colonial assembly raised taxes for their colony. The problem with the stamp tax was that it was raised not by the colonial assemblies, but by the Parliament of Great Britain. Colonists argued that this was, here's that bumper sticker, taxation without representation. Colonists accepted the right of Parliament to create taxes used to regulate trade within the British Empire, what they might have called external taxes, but they did not accept the power of Parliament to create taxes that would be charged directly to the colonial population. The colonists argued those taxes should be raised by the colonial assemblies, not Parliament. And of course, Parliament vehemently disagreed. They argued that they represented not just the freeholders of England, but all English subjects everywhere. Remember virtual representation. News of the Stamp Act passage arrived in the colonies in May of 1765. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, a new member of the House of Burgesses, introduced the Stamp Act resolution. Henry was an excellent parliamentarian and a speaker. He was a backcountry gentleman who had been a failure at pretty much every honest occupation he had tried, and so he had become a lawyer. Henry waited until the end of the session, when most of the members had gone home. When only 39 of the 116 delegates to the House of Burgesses were present, Patrick Henry introduced 6 resolutions. Only 4 of them passed. The 2 that failed were the most radical. The 4 that passed were the least radical. But the newspapers in Massachusetts and elsewhere wrote stories in which it appeared that all 6 resolutions had passed. Back in Massachusetts, the radicals of Massachusetts refused to be upstaged by aristocratic Virginia. The Massachusetts Assembly called for a Stamp Act Congress. Delegates from all of the colonies would meet and agree on a common strategy against the Stamp Act. The Massachusetts popular leadership mobilized the mob. A demonstration in Boston turned into a riot in front of the governor's mansion. The mob trashed the customs agent's house, literally tore it down, and burned the customs records. Now note that the customs agent was not the collector of the stamp tax, but some of the leaders of the Massachusetts mob were smugglers. So they used this as an opportunity to destroy customs records that might implicate them in smuggling. After they tore down the customs collector's house, the mob then moved to Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house. But some of the neighbors threatened the mob with guns, and it was dispersed and went home. The morning after the Boston riot, the Massachusetts stamp tax collector resigned. In Connecticut, Jared Ingersoll, a popular fellow and the new stamp tax collector for that colony, was surprised when he picked up the newspaper in the morning and found himself being compared on the front page to Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Christ. On his way to the legislature that morning, he was met by members of the Sons of Liberty and forced to resign as stamp agent. In Maryland, the Sons of Liberty held a mock funeral for the Stamp Act and buried it before the new stamp distributor. He got the idea and ran away to New York, where the New York Sons of Liberty carried him back to Maryland, where he resigned. The Sons of Liberty had become, in essence, America's first domestic terrorist organization. Riots and protests took place all over the colonies, most of them led by the Sons of Liberty. The stamped paper was destroyed or in some other way neutralized in every colony except for Georgia, where for a couple of days the stamped paper was used and then found and destroyed. Now, what was all this trouble over anyway? Why not just do as Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts and Ben Franklin and some other colonial leaders recommend? Obey the law, work diligently, and get it repealed. Well, there were a couple of reasons that are worth looking at this point. First, in English constitutional law, a precedent changes the Constitution. Now, England doesn't have a written constitution. It's based on the laws and statutes and the common law of England. So a precedent, that is, when you do something different for the first time, it becomes part of the law. It becomes part of the Constitution. If the colonists had obeyed the law, they believed that they would create a precedent that would firmly establish Parliament's right to tax them. Since they did not elect the British Parliament, they would have been unable to control Parliament, which could then pass any taxes that it wanted in reference to the colonies. Parliament would become a tyrant. Now, the second reason that they balked at this tax is the purpose of the tax was to pay royal officials. American legislatures dominated colonial governors because they could withhold the salaries of royal officials, especially the governor. If the Tax Act raised revenues and officials were paid out of those revenues, governors would become too independent of the colonial assemblies. Remember, we talked about governors in a couple of lectures ago. Too independent, they would be able to act without the colonial assembly having any leverage over them. This meant that the supremacy of the local assemblies would have been compromised. Meanwhile, in London, increasing pressure was brought on Parliament by merchants and opposition members for the repeal of the stamp tax. In 1763, Parliament was forced to repeal the tax. American opposition to the act had very little to do with the repeal, but it did worry some members of the British government. They asked the question, shall Parliament be obeyed? Some members of Parliament who had come around to the idea of repeal still argued that the colonists should be required at least to pay the tax once. Otherwise, American colonists would become the final judges of which English laws they would obey and which English laws they would ignore or riot over. Grenville's government fell, but Grenville was still a member of Parliament. He argued on the floor of the House of Commons that the repeal was not the end of Britain's problems with America. In fact, it was only the beginning. And by the way, Grenville was right. The Stamp Act was repealed, but Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Parliament had the right to pass legislation in reference to the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. Americans were too busy celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act to notice the Declaratory Act. They raised statues to King George III for saving them from this terrible tax, even though George III had nothing to do with it. All in all, colonists decided that the system worked, and the king, in spite of bad advice from his ministers and his parliament, had done the right thing by his American subjects. Now, this was total bull stuff, but the American colonists firmly believed that the king was their benefactor. The king had come to help them. So what did all the excitement in 1765 and 66 accomplish when all was said and done? Well, first, the colonies were far more unified than they had ever been before. The stamp tax had unified all of America against Parliament. Second, colonial protest helped to organize unification across the colonies. Third, and perhaps the most important, the colonies had stood nose to nose with Great Britain, and Great Britain had blinked first. On the English side, there were also a couple of lessons. The first was Britain was still deeply in debt. Nothing had changed in terms of Britain's debts. The second, news of the American celebration of the Stamp Act. Repeal reached England, and the members of Parliament began to worry about the future of their colonial possessions in North America. After Grenville fell, he was succeeded by a brilliant but rather erratic statesman by the name of Charles Townshend. He was not only a statesman, but also a well-known London playboy. His nickname was Champagne Charlie. He announced in Parliament that he had a plan to raise the necessary revenues in America without causing trouble. He really lied. He didn't have any such plan, but Parliament promptly took him at his word, and led by his political opponents, they lowered English property taxes. Townshend now had to figure out some way to tax the colony and make up for that tax loss. Townshend didn't have the beginning of a clue about how to tax the colonies, but he was stuck with the obligation of finding one, or finding something to do with himself outside of politics. In 1767, Parliament passed the so-called Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on glass, lead, paper, tea, and painter's colors. Now, this same law re-emphasized the existing laws. The reason that Townshend decided on customs duties on the import of these goods was because he had heard Benjamin Franklin talk about the difference between internal taxes, that is, taxes that are imposed on the people in the colony for internal purposes, and external taxes, that is, customs duties and other laws that are passed to regulate trade within the empire. Now, the colonists didn't make glass, lead, paper, tea, or painter's colors because, or nails for that matter, because it was cheaper to bring them in from England than it was to start up factories to build them in the Americas. So Townshend argued that the American colonists needed these products would pay for these products and would willingly pay a tax on the importation of these products. As we might expect, these duties caused a new rash of protests from the colonists. Generally, violence was not used, but customs agents in Boston and New York were roughly handled, and the colonials attempted to boycott these goods from Britain without terribly much success. Two regiments of British troops were quartered in Boston in 1770 to ensure that the laws would be enforced. On March 5th, 1770, a brawl between these troops and a street crowd developed into a riot. Across the street from the customs house, there was a tavern, and it was a tavern frequented by the working men of Boston. Now, on this night, a very cold and snowy night, the good Bostonians were sitting in the tavern getting increasingly drunker and complaining about the fact that the British troops in their off time would take jobs for less money than they would be paid if they took the job. At closing time, the workers staggered out of the tavern, and looking right across the street, they saw two British redcoats, two guards in front of the customs house. They began to yell abuse at the guards and began gradually crossing the street, throwing snowballs and yelling more abuse. By the time they got to the guards, some of them armed with sticks, and they began to push at the guards and make trouble. Now, at about this point in time, a file of British troops were walking along the street to change the guards at the various posts around the town, under the command of a Captain Preston. When the other troops reached the customs house guards, they gathered together there to defend themselves from the crowd who at this point was beginning to surround them, throwing snowballs and rocks and attempting to hit them with sticks. A shot rang out. British troops responded to the shot and discharged their weapons at point blank into the shouting, jostling civilians, killing 5 of them and wounding several others. Within 24 hours, this incident had achieved the name of the Boston Massacre. Although the action had very little to do with the issues at hand, those who died were made martyrs by the radicals and the colonial press. If you look at this slide, you'll see 2 pictures. The first one, top left, is a lot like what really happened. The second one, bottom right, is an etching, an engraving by Paul Revere. Now, if you'll notice, the first one is confused, and the crowd is surrounding the soldiers who are rather panicky. That's really what happened. If you look at the second one, it's broad daylight. The soldiers are arrayed in a column. They are firing resolutely on the Bostoners, and the commander is in the background giving the order to fire. This is a propaganda masterpiece, and it was run in newspapers all over the colony. The Boston Massacre. Meanwhile, in London, the failure of the Townshend Acts to raise any revenue and Townshend's general incompetence led to another shuffle in the ministry. King George's favorite minister, Lord North, took control of colonial policy. He promised to heal the wounds that had developed between England and the colonies. He repealed the Townshend Acts of 1770, all except for the small tax on tea, which he left as a reminder that England could tax the American colonies. as a result of his diligence, not to do anything to the colonists, a period of peace ensued that lasted for about 3 years. Now, this period of peace was disastrous for the more radical colonial leaders, folks like Sam Adams and John Hancock in Massachusetts and Patrick Henry in Virginia. They tried to rile the citizens up with speeches on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre and inflammatory newspaper articles, but all in all, things were returning to normal in the colonies. The radicals were worried that their political power and prestige in the colonies were based on opposition to Britain, and during this period of peace, they watched as their political primacy began to slip away. In 1773, in spite of his best intentions, Lord North gave the radicals what they needed. The problem was tea. The East India Company had a surplus of tea in English ports. The reason for this surplus had to do with popular trends in England. Tea drinking had gone out of fashion, and chocolate drinking had replaced it as the cool thing to do. Thousands of pounds of unwanted tea were rotting in English warehouses. In order to sell it more efficiently, North and Parliament decided they would make it available to retailers directly in America, where tea was still a popular drink. Now, the unfortunate thing about tea for the Americans was two things. First off, it had a tax on it, Townsend's tax, remember, the only one that wasn't removed. The second thing was that it was rather expensive because it went from the East India Company to London, where it was sold to distributors, who then exported it to America, where it was sold to distributors, who finally sold it to the shops that sold it to consumers. Now, every step along the way there was a profit, which meant that English tea was A, rather expensive, and B, covered in the dreaded tax. So what North proposed to do, and Parliament agreed, was allow the East India Company to sell their tea directly to American shops, directly to American retailers. That would cut out the middlemen, bring the price of tea down. Now, they didn't think about the tax. That hadn't occurred to them. In the meantime, since the tea tax, Americans were drinking smuggled Dutch tea, which, while not as tasty, was at least, I suppose, tea. The tax, of course, was the only tax left over from the Townshend Acts, the tax on tea, and it would be paid along with the sale of the tea to retailers. So the colonists themselves probably wouldn't have noticed it, but the American radicals were upset by the tax. To them, the tea tax was a vile conspiracy to force Americans to pay parliamentary taxes. It was even more insidious because it was sugar-coated by lower prices. The most astounding incident caused by the tea tax occurred in Boston. Radicals and members of the Sons of Liberty, loosely disguised as Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor that belonged to Boston merchants and poured the tea into the sea. Elsewhere in the colonies, the locals either refused to allow the tea to be unloaded or prevented its sale until the tea spoiled. The Boston Tea Party, as it was called, grabbed the attention of Britain and Parliament like nothing else so far. The British government had had enough. the government decided to punish Boston for the destruction of the East India Company's property. They passed a series of laws that the colonists quickly came to call the Intolerable Acts. The so-called Intolerable Acts were 4 laws passed by Parliament that affected specifically Massachusetts. The first was the Boston Port Bill, which closed Boston Harbor to all commerce until the Massachusetts colony paid for the destroyed tea. The second of these acts was the Massachusetts Government Act. The Charter of 1691 was suspended, and all officials who were not Crown appointees were dismissed from office. The Massachusetts Assembly was closed. Town meetings were forbidden to assemble without the permission of the governor, and a new royal governor was appointed, a military governor named General Thomas Gage, and we'll talk about him later on. The next act was called the Administration of Justice Act. Officials charged with crimes could be tried in England instead of Massachusetts, which meant that the English government had no faith at all in the Massachusetts justice system. Now, this was especially unfair because the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre had been tried in Boston and acquitted of all charges. The jury had brought back a decision that they had acted in their own defense. So this is a truly unfair law. Finally, the Quartering Act. Massachusetts was ordered to provide and pay for all troops quartered in the colony, and if they didn't pay for places where the troops could bivouac, then they were required to put British troops up in private homes. The shocked American colonists responded by calling the First Continental Congress. It first considered a proposal to stand as a body to accept or reject British laws. This proposal failed. Next, they considered and approved a series of motions from the town meeting in Suffolk, Massachusetts, which declared that Great Britain had no right to pass the Intolerable Acts. The Congress sent a declaration of rights and grievances to Britain, demanding the return of their rights as English subjects and the repeal of all laws passed by Parliament in reference to the colonies since 1763, that they felt deprived them of their just rights as Englishmen. The most important action of the Congress was to urge the American colonies to boycott trade with Great Britain. It also created an association of the colonies that were to enforce the boycott. The Continental Association became the first quasi-legal American organization for legal enforcement. And having done that, the First Continental Congress adjourned with the understanding that it would reconvene the next year.